Good morning, friends. Thanks for joining me in our Unfolding the Word studies. Glad to have you with me today. We're continuing in a study of 2 Peter. We're now in the second chapter. We've been examining issues related to false teachers. I want to pick up our reading today in verse 4 and read on through verse 9, even though we've already begun to examine those verses. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, then if he didn't spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, the herald of righteousness, along with 7 others, whom when he brought the flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. We've been talking about the danger of false teachers. After building throughout the first chapter the picture of the wonder of God's precious and great promises, how they are of the God-breathed words and that which is the foundation for life and godliness, God turns attention in the second chapter to reminding us of the real danger of false teachers. That just as false prophets plagued Israel in the Old Testament, so false teachers will plague the church in our New Testament era. We continued to, after getting some insight into the nature of these false teachers, then we began to look, and that's what we're continuing our look at, the issue of judgment of God upon the false teachers. The message from God in these verses is that if God did this, if God did this, if God did this, then he will also do that. Meaning, if God dealt in a judgmental way with the false teachers, with these examples throughout the Old Testament, then we can have confidence he'll continue to work that way in the New. Last time, we looked in verses 4 and 5 about the example of the fallen angels, and we also talked about the example given here of the flood and God's operation in it. Now today, we're picking up on yet another of the examples, and that is what we find in verses 6 and 7 and 8, where we are talking about God's judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah that we encounter in the Old Testament. So let's continue to look at this message. And let me remind you, the issue here is that God is telling us, while it may not make sense to us, God has reasons for allowing the presence of the false teacher or the false prophet in the Old Testament to continue for a while before he implements judgment. Then we need to understand that purpose that he has in it may not always be clear to us, but if the false prophet or the false teacher has not been judged yet by God, it's not because God doesn't have the power to do so. It's that God has a purpose unfolding in the midst of their activity. Okay, let's turn to our next attention. He says, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example. In other words, the for if in this case, in that equation we've been examining, is the for if of God's judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah. We learn about Sodom and Gomorrah in the book of Genesis. You remember that was a city, those were cities, towns, especially characterized by sexual perversion. Not only that in terms of sin, but especially that. In Genesis 13:13, we were told the men of Sodom were wicked and great sinners before God. By the way, if you're looking for some biblical frame of reference to make sense out of sexual perversion, and particularly the perversion of homosexuality in its many forms, you don't have to look further than this opening book of the Scriptures to have a clear picture of how God perceives it. In Genesis 18, verses 20 and 21, God is speaking to Abraham and he says, listen, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave. I am going to go down to see whether they've done altogether according to that outcry. In the 19th chapter, then we read in verses 27 to 29 in Genesis, And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all of the land of the valley, and he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. And so it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Okay. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah were sinners, but that's not unique because all mankind sins. That's the reason Jesus is needing to come into the world to die for our sins. But uniquely in their era, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were standing out as exemplars of wickedness and immorality, self-centeredness, ungodliness. They were, the magnitude of what they were doing was such that there was an even greater and more immediate response from God because of their lives than because of the example that they set. Listen, if Sodom and Gomorrah were looked upon by God as particularly worthy of judgment because of their immorality, their ungodliness, their lack of concern for spiritual truth. Who of us lives in a country nowadays or in a nation nowadays that doesn't equally deserve God's judgment upon it for those very same reasons? Well, at any rate, as I read to you, and as you already knew the story, I'm certain, out of Genesis, the outcome of God's implementation of judgment was that the city and the people were turned to ashes. And this was to become an example to us of God's determination of inescapable judgment for sin to come. I was thinking how it puts it later on in the 3rd chapter of 2 Peter, and we'll be looking at that not too distant future as we continue in our studies here. But let me read the verses to you. In verse 10 of the 3rd chapter of 2 Peter, it says, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar. Then the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be, living lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming day of the Lord, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn." All right? God is saying to us, the inevitability and then implementation of judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah reminds us of the inevitability of the judgment upon the false teachers. But here in this last example, God adds another element to the equation of if they do this, then God will judge. And that is that God tells us here that he rescued Lot and his family. His wife rejected that rescue and was turned to a pillar of salt. The passage tells us that Lot, as he lived in the midst of this great, immoral, wicked world that he was involved in the culture of those cities, his soul was distressed. He was tormented by the sin that was around him. You ever had that distress of soul and torment as you look around at the corruption that is around you? I certainly feel that within the context of what life is like in the United States far too frequently. Have you been grieved by your contemporary culture? Well, what God says in this particular verse to us is that just as God's judgment is certain, so also his rescue is certain for those that know him. The certainty of judgment combined with the certainty of rescue. Now, what's the point? The point is that we serve a God who intervenes in history always according to his nature. He intervenes to judge because he is holy and righteous and just. But he also intervenes to rescue because he is merciful, gracious, and loving. He says, if these things be so, and of course, they are so, they are so, then God is going to operate in history in dealing with the false teachers according to that criteria. So do you believe the biblical record? I like the way it's phrased, if these things be so, because it's all then basing it on, do you take God at his word? Do you believe what the Bible responds to us with? Not much solution unless we accept that truth, that these precious and great promises, these biblical records, are God-breathed, authoritative, and inspired by God. And he makes these promises in it, and let me end with these. The promise, first of all, is that God knows how to rescue. Verse 9, God knows how to rescue his children, even in the midst of immoral, messed up worlds. He rescued Noah, and he rescued Lot. But the other passage ends with, in verse 9, he also knows how to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. God knows how to keep the unrighteous accountable. He watches over that. You can rest assured that when the time is right, God's judgment will fall on the false teachers. He holds them accountable. All right, what's the bottom line? God takes teaching seriously, and he takes false teachers seriously. And then, so should we. So should we. Well, join me tomorrow as we continue to examine these verses in 2 Peter.